Well, we can get started. It's 6:30, so. Mark, you want to open us in prayer?
Sure. Dear Father, we thank you so much for just another day of life that you've given all of us. We thank you for an opportunity to study your word more. I pray that you would guide us as we look at the book of Genesis. I pray that we would just learn more about you, that we would love you more, and that you would help us to apply your word to our lives. Please be with Bill as he teaches us. Please give him just clarity and help him to be faithful to your word. In my prayer.
Amen. Well, good morning. Very quiet. Sorry. Well, I'm going to be here for the next 2 weeks, and then I think Ben Robbins teaching for a week, and then I'll be back for another 2 weeks. So over 8 sessions, I really want to cover Genesis 1 through 11. I love the book of Genesis. I think if we understand these first 11 chapters, we're really going to understand much of our Bible. The first 11 chapters of Genesis form kind of the foundation for what comes from Genesis 12 to Revelation 22. It, like everything from understanding why we're here, how we got here, we understand why the world is in such a mess. We understand why we are looking for a hope of redemption. All these things are found in the first 11 chapters. We understand why we end the book, in the Bible, Genesis 20 or Revelation 21 and 22. Where are we in those last 2 chapters? We're in a garden with a river running through the middle, right? Which is just like where we started the Bible. So Genesis 1 through 11 is really, really, really important. Just by way of some of the stuff you have on your sheet, Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Who's he writing to? Israel. Anyone know where they are at the time of his writing? They're either in the wilderness or just getting into the land. Why might that be important? Without looking at your sheet. Sorry, Kelly. Why might that be important? Understanding who he's writing to and kind of the situation they're in is going to be really important for understanding what he writes. So where are they? Where have they just left? Egypt, which is a really just godly nation, right? They just bow the knee to Yahweh alone, right? What are they? Pagan. They worship a lot of gods. And where is Israel going? Which is just another godly nation, right? What do? They're pagans, right? They worship many gods. So why might Moses be writing to Israel?
To remind them who their God is.
So they're surrounded by a culture that says, here are all these gods, and here are all these worship practices that involve a whole lot of immorality. And Moses is writing to these people who have either just entered the land or are about to enter the land, and he's saying, here's who your God is. And there's only one of them. So when you go into the land, you should only worship one God, right? And why does God care so much about this small, little, insignificant nation? Genesis is going to tell us why. Because if we just pick up with Exodus, the whole story makes no sense. Why does God care about Israel? Why doesn't he care about the superpower? I mean, he does, but why so much intentional care for Israel? So if we understand Genesis, and specifically Genesis 1 through 11, we're going to understand so much of what's going on. And if we understand who he's writing to, when he's writing to, we're going to understand what he's saying to them. So with that in mind, let's just look at Genesis 1, and we'll just look at the first 2 verses. Somebody want to read just those first 2 verses? Genesis 1, 1 through 2.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters.
The first three words sound familiar? Anywhere else in the Bible we read those first three words? John 1:1, right? So, not that we're going to go there and talk about John, but why might John say those things? What does he want to remind us of? Genesis 1:1, right? So here, in the beginning, God. These first four words introduce us to the main character of the rest of the Bible. In the beginning, God. And who else? Spirit's here. Verse 2, right? But besides this creating God, who else is in existence at this point? Nobody. So we have this one God, this by himself alone God. We know from the rest of the Bible there's the Trinity, right? So there is this interrelationship between the one God. But God is by himself. At this point, this is pre-time. We haven't gotten to the next word yet, but in the beginning, God, right? God alone. From these first four verses, what can we kind of draw out? What might be some implications of just these four words?
God is not created.
He's not created, so he's eternal, right? What else?
He's not competing with other so-called gods.
So he's the only God, right?
There's no like chaos creation story. It's just him. It's not a war. It's just him created.
Yep. So we have a God who is by himself. He's not rivaled by anything, not by his creation, right? What else? Think about us. Are we dependent creatures? What do you need to live?
A lot of things. Food, water, and air.
Food, water, air. You don't have any of those for some time, you're going to die. What is God dependent on? He's self-sufficient. This is in the beginning God, and the implication is this God is eternal. He exists before time begins. He needs nothing to exist. He has life in himself. When he creates, is he under compulsion by something outside of himself? Like, is something forcing God to do what we read in the next word? No. So he's what? He's sovereign. He's free. Like, even in these four words, we begin to be able to construct a theology about this God that this is a big God. This is a God who has no rivals. This is a God who's been here forever. This is a God who's creating because he wants to create. He chooses to create. So in the beginning, God created. This is an interesting word. This Hebrew word is only used of God himself. This Hebrew word it's only a divine act. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So how much of the stuff in the universe did God create? All of it, right? Yeah. Now, this word for create, it can, in certain contexts, have the idea of making something out of other stuff. But in the context here, what's God creating out of? What pre-existent material is he making stuff out of? Nothing. Because we're going to read in verse 3 that he's creating everything by what? Speaking, right? One interesting note, that word earth, it's the Hebrew word eretz. That word is going to be used throughout the first 5 books of the Bible whenever we refer to the promised land. And we have to understand, Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, and we should read these first 5 books not as independent 5 books that are unrelated to themselves, but as one story. And what we're going to see, we're not going to get into it today, but this idea of creation and the promised land are going to be very closely connected. So we'll get there later on, a couple weeks from now. First verse, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Any questions up to this point? Anything that just jumps off the page? Are we Israel? Is the United States Israel? No. Is the church in a spiritual Israel? I think we are. And very much like Israel, are we in a hostile society? A society that's not a friend to godliness and biblical theology? Just like them, it's really important we understand where we came from. It's really important that we understand that there's one God. This is our God, and He alone is deserving of worship. What is one of the big things God is telling Israel they should not do? What should they not worship? Other gods or idols, right? Why? Genesis 1:1 forms the basis, the foundation for this idea of no idol worship. Same thing for us, right? We don't bow the knee to anything but God, because He alone is deserving. He alone is God. All right, verse 2. The earth was without form and void. Darkness is over the face of the deep. So this world now that exists, this earth, is it habitable? Are these conditions that are just very hospitable to life? Darkness, right? Chaos, it's without form, it's void, it's empty. No. So we have an uninhabitable ball of mass at this point. And then what do we have happening in the second half of verse 2? It says the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So this could be, the word for spirit could be translated wind. There are a number of places, though, in Deuteronomy and Exodus that refer to God's Spirit giving someone gifts, or God's Spirit hovering over the nation of Israel. I think that we can say this is not just wind, this isn't an impersonal force here. The context, I think we can see that this is God's Spirit. The word hovering has the idea of this bird gathering together its chicks and kind of covering them. The Spirit of God is covering the waters, and we have the idea He's beginning to show us that there's going to be this creation, this forming, this creating a habitable world. So verse 3. Verse 3 through verse 25, we're going to kind of go fairly quickly, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to just interrupt me and say, wait a second, we're going too fast. What's going on here? There's going to be a formula through these days of creation. There's going to be repetition intentionally. So the first thing, what happens in verse 3? The first three words. He speaks, right? We're introduced now to a God who speaks. God said, let there be light. And then there was this cosmic conflict between God and light, and God overpowered light, and thus light was, right? No. You understand that in the culture that Israel is in, that's what the nations believe, that the gods are in conflict with creation, and because the gods are more powerful than creation, they overcome creation and they have their way. Do we read that here? Is God rivaled by creation? Does He have to struggle with this material for it to do what He wants? He says, and what happens? He says, let there be light, and there was light. Instantaneous. He speaks, and it is. So what do we learn about this God's words? They're what? They're life-giving. What else? They're creative. They have the ability to create. What else are they? I'm thinking of a word that starts with a P. They're powerful. He speaks and it is, right? He said, let there be light, there was light. You're going to read that throughout the days of creation. He said, and it was so. He said, and it was so. There's this repetition. His word is effectual. When he wants it to do, when he wants something to happen, he speaks, and guess what? It happens. We have God's word, do we not? Is it powerful? Is it effectual? Does it accomplish what God desires? It does, right? So we're introduced to a God who is unrivaled, who is alone. And this God speaks, and when he speaks, there's power in his word. So he creates light, verse 3, and there's light. Verse 4, and God saw that the light was what? It was good. So now God is giving an assessment of what he's made. It's good. God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening. There was morning, the first day. Now, if you know anything about Genesis, you know this word day creates quite a bit of debate, right? What is the debate about, this word day? How long is this? Right? And we get into this debate. Is it 24 hours or Psalm 90 uses the word day and talks about a day unto the Lord is like 1,000 years. Is this a long period of time or a short period of time? And I think Moses would come into our debate and say, what are you guys talking about? Right? Is Moses intending to tell us how old the creation is here? Is that Moses' intention? Is that the author's intention? No. What's his intention? Who's he writing to? What situation are they in? He's writing to Israel, who's about to go into the land. He's telling them about don't worship other gods. He's not trying to start a scientific debate. Now, I'm not ashamed to tell you where I stand on that stuff. I don't think this is a core Christian doctrine that should divide God's people. I do think when you read in Exodus 20 that in 7 days God created, or 6 days God created, the seventh day he rested, therefore Israel, you should rest on the Sabbath day. I think the way Moses uses it is for a 24 period, but I don't think that's our intention here is to get into a debate about the earth, the age of the earth. I think he's trying to show us something unique, that this God is unrivaled. That's the point. Questions, comments, anything on that? All right. So the second day, verse 6. God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse heaven. There was evening, there was morning, the second day. So God says, and what happens? It happens, thank you. This is a really big one. Water in the ancient Near East is a big deal. This represents this major force, often a force that is rivaling the gods. And here, God's doing what? He's creating the sky. He's separating the waters. Simply by his word, there's no struggle. There's no pushing back and rebellion against his word. He just says, and it happens. Notice something else in the first day, the second day. What does he do? He does what? When he names them, what does that show? Authority, right? So when he names something, he's showing that I'm kind of the authority over this. He gives it a name. Just like when parents have a child, they give it a name, showing that they have authority over this child. Here, God is creating and naming. He is authoritative over his creation. So day 1, we have light. Day 2, we have sky. Day 3, notice there's 2 different acts on day 3. Verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. There's another act on day 3. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, there was morning, the 3rd day. So what are the 2 different acts on day 3? He separates waters, and we see what now here?
Dry land.
Dry land. And then what else happens on this dry land? There's what?
Greenery.
There's greenery, there's plants, right?
Plants.
And they're reproducing after what? Their own kind. This shows that God's creation is what? There's order. Who said that? Very good. Yes, there's order to his creation. This God speaks, it happens, and there's order when he creates. Things are reproducing after their own kinds, or we would call it within their own families or species, right? There's this ordered creation. So day 1, light. Day 2, we got sky. Day 3, we not only have land, but vegetation. Now, I don't know necessarily the great significance of what is about to happen, but the second half of these 3 days of creation are going to fill what God created. So he creates light, right? Well, now there's going to be this kind of ordering of the light in the 4th day, verse 14. Somebody want to read 14 to 19?
And God said, let there be light in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. God made the 2 great lights, the great light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day.
Okay. So on the 4th day, first day we have kind of this way out there light, and now what's happening? This way out there is being what? Filled, right? Now we have a sun, we have a moon, we have stars. And what's really interesting is, what did we find in verse 2? Chapter 1, verse 2, that this world that God's created at verse 2 is what? Dark, right? It's empty. You can't live on it. And what's happening progressively? We're getting light. We're getting sky. We're getting ground. We're getting plants. Now we're getting sun and moon and stars. And what is the purpose of the sun and moon and stars? To give what? Light to what?
To mark seasons.
To mark seasons. But what is the light for? To give light to the earth. So what seems to be, now we know, right, just scientifically the sun is at the center of the solar system, but what seems to be the focal point of creation? Earth. All of the things that are happening in these days of creation are intending to make earth what? Habitable. Because we're actually working towards something here. So now we have the fifth day. What happened on the second day? He creates what? Starts with an S, rhymes with a chi. Sky, right? He creates sky. What's he going to do with the sky on the fifth day? Yeah. And he also created what? He separates waters above and waters beneath. So there's sea. And what's he going to do with the sea on day 5? Fill it. So let's read about that. Verse 20. Somebody want to read verse 20 through verse 23?
Then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of heavens." So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, to which the waters abound, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the sea, and let birds multiply on the earth." The evening and the morning were the 5th day.
Okay. So now we have light, and now this outer expanse is filled with stars and greater and lesser lights. Now we have a sea and a sky that are empty until day 5. And now we have birds that fill the sky. We have fish and sea creatures that fill the waters. Is there any struggle at this point? No struggle. He's still speaking, and it's happening. All right. So now, remember, day 3 had 2 acts of creation, right? Creating land and then creating vegetation. Day 6 is going to have 2 acts. The first act is going to be creating animals. Second act is going to be creating who? Humans. So let's look at verse 24. I'll read that. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Notice what's distinct on day 6. Animals and what? We haven't read the second part, but animals and who? And man. So are we just animals like everybody else that have just kind of evolved better, more advanced? What are we finding that's distinct here? God is making very clear, at least his revealed truth is telling us that there's a distinction between humans and everything else that God created. That we're not beasts. There's something different. But this dry ground that God made is now becoming what? Full. And there's a word that's repeated all over that first part of the 6th day. According to their kind. Again, what did we read on the 3rd day? That plants are reproducing after their own kind. 6th day, animals reproduce after their own kind. This creation is continually showing that it is ordered. It's ordered. God creates certain kinds or species, and they reproduce, and it stays in these species. There's order to his creation. So we've gone from a world that is dark and empty and kind of chaotic to now we have an earth that has consistent light. There's waters above, waters below. There's dry ground. There's plants. There's birds. There's fish. There's animals. Does that sound like a habitable place now? And it's ordered. Things stay in their kinds. We've gone from chaos to order. Chaos to this creation that is habitable, that's hospitable to life. We have one last act of creation. And I think when we read it, we're going to see that there's a vast difference, right? The language is going to change. We've gone from God said, and there was this, and we have all these things, and now just notice the difference in vocab. Verse 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. What is just some difference in language that we're reading here? He says us and our, right? So that's not been mentioned thus far, right? It's different. What else is different?
There's an attention to detail.
Okay.
He doesn't previously describe how exactly all of the birds in the
All I know is
creatures,
said, right?
Yeah, which is big bear creature.
Yeah. What's different here about what detail is added here?
Made in his own image.
They're made in his image. Okay?
Where the past God just commanded it was, he seems to dignify man by consulting himself about how he was created.
Yeah. Yep. So there's a lot of details here we're going to talk about. We're going to slow down a lot right now. But just notice that when you read the Bible, when there's patterns like this, and he said, and it was, and this and that, and then there's a big shift, there's a big change, that's showing us something significant has changed, right? This is the high point of creation now. All right, so let's just talk. Let's look at the words us and our and say, what in the world is going on here? Didn't you just tell us that there's only one God? The whole point of Genesis 1 is that there's only one God, and now we've gone from singular to what? Plural, right? What do we do with that? What do you do with the words us and our? There are 4 main views of what we do with this. I'm not going to give you any of them yet. So what do you think we do with this?
Well, according to one view, they're the plurals of majesty.
Okay, so that is one view. Can you explain that view a little bit? Plural of majesty, if you didn't hear.
That, well, God being king and ruler, he's referring to himself in the plural as the one who has authority.
Yep, so the idea of a plural of majesty is in this culture, kings could refer to themselves in the plural because they're just majestic. So here we could have God being the king of the universe, referring to himself in a majestic way. That is an option. That is certainly within the bounds of biblical orthodoxy. God is king and God is majestic. So that's one view. What else is there out there?
This is the Trinity.
That we have the Trinity, okay? Explain the Trinity to us.
Oh, sure. You have God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Son, and the Spirit. And then I think that they're they were also not created, Jesus and the Spirit. So they're relationally relating to each other. They're creating together. And that's what this is showing, that they're together and creating and not created.
Okay, so we have one God who eternally exists in 3 distinct persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. All 3 persons are God, but they're distinct. So we have the word us and our, and this could be a reference to the fact that this one God is also 3 persons. Okay, so we have the option of the Trinity, we have the plural of majesty. There's 2 more out there.
Imprecision of language.
What's that?
Imprecision of language, basically belief that that's an error, or that it's not directly speaking to God's majesty or its quantity.
Okay.
It's just
kind of
word
vague.
choice. Yeah, vague.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. No, you were. I saw your hand first, and then you can.
I'm not sure if I'm reading something too late in the Bible into this place, but I think somewhere in Psalms we see something called the divine council. And so I'm not sure if that's one of the views where it's like God has this sort of concept where he's like consulting somebody, but it's kind of himself, it's kind of other spiritual beings perhaps, and scholars are not always super sure what it is. I don't know. Is that one of them?
That is. A third view is the divine council. So God confers with this divine council, most likely angels, and then creates. So far, the first two, I'd say, they're within the bounds of that makes sense. But what might be the problem with God consulting with other spiritual beings to create? Where did they come from is a problem, but
It says our image.
Yeah.
And so that would be a problem.
That's a
That
problem.
we're not just made in the image of God, we're made in the image of everybody who's in the divine council, whoever they are.
Yeah. So if we're created in the image of God and whatever else is in this divine council, that makes no sense to me, right? We're created in the image of who? Of God, right? Not God plus. So that's one option that's out there. I don't think that one makes any sense to me. I don't think it makes any sense of the text. Do you have one?
I was, just looking at it, it seems that God is wanting us to see that he's revealing something new about himself that he hasn't before.
Yeah.
So this next pivot is really important.
It's really important. Yeah. The fourth one is the idea of self-deliberation. So God, in a sense, by using us, some people think it's an intentional pause to show that what's about to happen is just like you said. This is a big deal. I think those three ideas of self-deliberation, majesty, and Trinity are all within the bounds of you can believe that, and like that's an option. I think the Trinity, I want to pump the brakes there because is that true? Right? It is. Is Moses and Israel going to understand that? Maybe not, right? What I do think we can say is this is dropping kind of the seeds in the ground for what the Bible is going to water throughout the rest of, there's this plural aspect. I don't think we can get the Trinity directly from this text, right? But I think it's implying it's there. So I tend to say that's part of it because the Holy Spirit's the author of Genesis ultimately, and he's going to show us something, especially in the New Testament, that's like, oh yeah, we can read back and be like us and our and be like, definitely I see the Trinity. I like the idea of a plural of majesty in the context as well. So I want to do something unique and say, let's just squish a couple of those views together and just say it's maybe more than one of those views. I think Trinity is there if we understand that if all we have is this verse, we don't have the Trinity, right? But it can be a foundation for what's going to happen throughout the Bible. And then this God is a king who is majestic. So he says, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. We have these two words, image and likeness. What does that mean? You're created in the image and likeness of God. What does that mean? That's a phrase we throw around a lot. A whole lot. And I'm not sure that we always know what we're meaning by that. So I think it's important that we define what that means. If somebody comes up to you in your job and says, hey, Christian, what does it mean that you're created in the image and likeness of God?
One thing is that we're supposed to reflect God's character, and that he means for like the populating the earth with humans to be setting up reflections of his character everywhere. The image for how good he is, how glorious he is.
Yeah. good. Reflecting God's character. Okay. Anything else?
Having authority like God.
Ah. That's even in the text, right? Talks about having dominion, right? Okay.
Being rational.
Relational? Rational? Yeah. Okay. What else? We have rational, reflecting his character, dominion, authority.
There's an inherent value that because it made it this supremely valuable in his image.
Yeah.
That they too then have a special value that other creations.
That's going to be, we're going to put a pin on that and come back to that. That's I think, a vital application of this text, right? If we don't get this understanding with that application, that's a big reason for all the mess we're in, right? We're treating each other like we're not image bearers. Relational, social, right? Okay, so normally people, when you read a big theology book, they're going to talk about how we have intellect, will, and all of these things, right? We're God's image bearers because, like him, we have intellect, we have desire, we have rationality. And I think those are all true implications. But I think the text that we're actually in is going to help us define for itself what he means. Who said dominion and authority? Is that you, Sri? Yeah, let's look at actually this text, right? So we're created in the image and likeness, and then what does he tell us to have? The next phrase. Let him have what? Dominion, authority. He's going to tell us in verse 28 that we're to fill the earth and what? Subdue it. So what does God have over his creation? Authority. And what does he delegate to these image bearers that he doesn't give to the rest of creation? Authority, right? We as image bearers have his authority. We kind of are sub-rulers who represent God on the earth. And something that we aren't going to get from the text directly is the word image and likeness. Moses is stealing from the culture and their concepts. So the word image is used often throughout pagan worship of an image, right? A statue. And what is infused in the idea of these images of gods is that these images are representations, visible representations of their rule and authority, right? So when he uses the word image, I think he's telling us that humans are visible representations of God's authority on earth. And he proves that out by telling us that we're to subdue the earth. We have dominion over the earth. And the word likeness in pagan cultures has the idea that this of sonship. So anyone know what Pharaoh was considered to be? He's considered the son of God, right? Turn ahead just a couple chapters to chapter 5 and read verse 1. Chris, you want to read verse 1? Genesis 5, verse 1.
This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God.
Okay. And then he has a son named Seth in verse 3, and he's created in the likeness of who? Adam. So the idea of likeness is tied to sonship. You don't have to turn there, but in Luke chapter 3, anyone know what Adam is called? Son of God, right? So Adam as an image bearer is considered not a physical offspring, but a son of God in the sense of he's distinct from all creation. He's special. So what we have in image and likeness is man is an under-ruler who, I think Zach may have said, been the one who said this, who is supposed to, intended as a son to reflect God's nature. So understanding that man has this unique authority and is going to have this commission to represent God on earth, represent his rule on earth, and represent and reflect his image, like his glory on earth. We're way different than the rest of creation. Way different. Questions on that? I don't want to just skip ahead. Any questions? I think that's really important that we grasp this. Anyone read Colossians lately? Colossians 1:15, what does it say about Christ?
He's the firstborn over all creation.
And he is the what of the invisible God?
The image of the invisible God.
So who's the true human? Who is the high point of humanity? In a sense, the second great Adam. It's Jesus, right? That's our Sunday school answer, right? But Genesis 1:26, that's all of us, but the most perfect representation of God's rule and authority, his true son, this is Christ. Ultimately. All right. So we're to have dominion over what? Birds, fish, livestock. We're not one of them, we're over them. We have dominion over everything that creeps on the earth. And then verse 27. If we didn't get it in verse 26, he's going to tell us it a couple more times in verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. And what's different at the end of verse 27? Male and female. So now we have gender, which is given sovereignly by who? God himself. And it's a good thing, right? Because everything he makes thus far is good. So I want to come back to this idea of having inherent worth and dignity as image bearers. Let's flesh that out. Like, hey, what are some areas where you look at our culture and you're like, man, we are getting off base because we aren't acting like that? What are some ways that in our fallen, depraved nature, we treat each other like we're not image bearers? Slander. Explain how that could potentially act like someone does not have inherent worth as an image bearer.
Yeah, I mistakenly watched YouTube political commentary, and just the way they were talking about a particular person, just like subhuman.
Yeah.
Like, how this person get human, how this person did this. They had no worth. It was like they were less than.
Yeah. So slander can be a way that we tear each other down and treat each other less than image bearers. What else?
Like cancel culture. So like literally canceling a person because you don't agree with the set values that holds, you just don't exist.
Yeah, you seem to be less than human because we don't agree. Yeah. What might be some areas if we actually grasped this, things would be vastly different. Like just think about some of 2020. What were some of the problems? We had political problems, right? I don't know, maybe you noticed like there was some tension politically. What would happen if even where we can sharply disagree, we realize that the person that we were disagreeing with, though we may think they're wrong, actually is an image bearer of God? Might that help us a little bit? I don't know, maybe you heard there were some racial discussions in 2020. What would happen even if we don't agree fully on our ideology and philosophy of how we look at this, if we realize that the person that we disagree with, or this group of people, is an image bearer of God. Like, I think theologically, if we start there as the base of our view of humanity, that all people are inherently deserving of worth and value and dignity because they bear the image of our Maker, we'll treat each other a whole lot different, right? What does he tell us in the book of James? Like, we tear down people who are what? We use our words to tear down people who are made in God's what? Image. So the idea that we're image bearers, that should dictate how we treat each other, even people we disagree with. Even groups of people that we may consider to be in a sinful lifestyle. They're not less than in the sense of we should treat them less than human. All people are image bearers, regardless of skin color, regardless of economic status, regardless of education level. Like, if we can get back to realizing that and actually consistently seeking to treat each other like that, I think we need to go back to Genesis. I think that's a huge part of our problem is we've lost sight. Any further thoughts on that?
That's maybe, it's maybe a little out of the text, but also gives the gravity and the sin as well, that an image of God would
Yeah.
be adverse to the nature of God.
Yeah. So the diversity here is a beautiful thing, but also the sin against other people is a big deal because we're sinning against someone who's reflecting God's glory in a sense. And though that image is marred by sin, it's not perfect like pre-fall, it's still a big deal. It's still a huge deal.
I'm also thinking, how precious the life of man is.
Yeah.
Like if you go to Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image.
Yeah, we're going to see in Genesis 9, when they get off of the ark, this is a big deal. Like, life is a big deal, very valuable to God because it bears his image. Doesn't say that about the animals. It says it about man. It's a very good observation. All right, just for the sake of time, let's press on through verse 31. And God blessed them. So this is going to be verse 28, one theologian, his name's G.K. Beale, thinks is the most important verse of the whole Bible. The whole Bible fleshes this out. I'm not sure if I agree with that fully, but I do think that it's really important. He blesses them. When you read Genesis, you're going to read this word blessing over and over and over. You're going to read it when God makes a covenant with Noah. He blesses. You're going to read it when he makes a covenant with Abraham, that Abraham's offspring are supposed to be a what to the nation? Blessing. Blessing. And there's coming one who will be through Abraham's line who will bless the nations, right? When God makes a covenant with Israel, if they obey, they're what? Blessings, right? David is going to have an offspring who will be a blessing. So this word shows up in all of the covenants until you get to the new covenant when this expected blessing comes. So God, he blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves on the earth. Understanding that image bearers are what? They're under rulers who are going to demonstrate and reflect God's rule on the earth and reflect his glory on the earth. So what is he trying to fill the earth with? His rule and his glory. Notice the commission in verse 28 is that these glory reflectors, these rule reflectors fill the earth. And what are they filling the earth with? God's dominion. What are they filling the earth with? God's glory. Pre-fall, the commission to fill the earth with God's glory was through procreation. Do you notice that the church has the same commission to fill the earth with God's glory? Only we don't do it through procreation. We do it through evangelism, which leads to regeneration, where God's glory is going to fill, his rule is going to fill the earth by the spread of the gospel as people believe the gospel and begin to worship God. That's why missions is really important. We're trying to see God's glory cover the earth. Like waters cover the sea. If you've ever been out to sea, what's everywhere? Water. And what does the psalmist in those texts tell us? He wants to see God's glory be everywhere. Verse 29. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, every tree with seed in its fruit, for you have them for food. And every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. Before we get to verse 31, not only were these lights for the earth, but now everything on the earth God has given for who? For man, right? So all this, at least in Genesis 1, all of this stuff is culminating in here's man. And what has been God's assessment of everything up to verse 30? He said there was, and it was what? Good. You notice how we said when there's a difference in vocab, it's a big deal? It signals something. Somebody want to read verse 31?
And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day.
What's different? Wording-wise? Very good. So now God's done with his creation. He's created man in his image. He now has a under-ruler to represent his dominion, to reflect his nature. And now the assessment of his completed creation is not that it's good, that it's very good. If you make something, it's often a reflection of yourself. Here, creation is a reflection of its creator. The creator is very good. Therefore, the creation is very good. All right, let's just go through the next 3 verses because I want to just finish this section. And then on Thursday, we'll do chapter 2. But chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 actually finishes out the 7th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day God finished his work that he had done, and rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day. He made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. He repeats. What did he do? He finished it, and he what? He rested, right? This word rest does not imply that he's tired. This isn't like 6 days and he's gasping for air and he's like, I need a rest. God's undiminished in his power. Well, this word rest simply means that he ceased. He creates. There's nothing more to create, so he ceases. He rests. What's different here? What do you not see? Remember, Genesis 1 through Genesis 2:3 has this almost rhythmic like nature. He creates, he says it is, it was so, there was evening, there was morning, the whatever day. What do you not see here in the formula? Well, he doesn't create anything, but also what do you see at the end of the 7th day?
Not the morning light. He's still resting.
Well, you said it. Say it a little bit louder.
There's not a morning night, meaning God is still resting.
Yeah. So the idea is this 7th day hasn't stopped. He's not creating anything anymore. Does that mean God's not working? He still sustains his creation. He still sovereignly oversees his creation. But the work of creation itself, he's in a state of rest. Right? Hebrews 4 tells us that that there is for the believer what? A rest. Right? We can enter into this rest with the Lord. Because he's in a state of rest. And for us, through Christ, there's an access to this. So here we have 7 days of creation. We've gone from nothing besides God himself to God speaking, and everything that we see and we cannot see, even with our strongest telescopes, everything is made out of nothing. The only problem is that this earth in verse 2 is uninhabitable. But God, day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is going from chaos to order. Uninhabitable to habitable. The high point is mankind himself in the image and likeness of God. We didn't say this, but notice both men and women are both fully image bearers, like fully equal image bearers, male and female, in his image. And he's given them this commission to fill the earth with under rulers who reflect his glory. And then he rests. All right. So questions, comments, disagreements, anything you want to talk about? Yes.
So I understand that like God is rested from creation now, because obviously he's not creating earth over and over. But isn't he going to create a new heavens and new earth? And like, I don't know, how does that fit?
Yeah. That's a good question. So, if you go back to verse 1, the word beginning, I didn't say this, but that Hebrew word has the idea of a beginning with an end in view. So this word for beginning actually has the idea that there's an end goal, like there's an end date, right? It's the idea in Revelation, he comes back, right? In this present age, this present world as we know it ends, and 2 Peter tells us it's consumed, and we have a new heaven and a new earth. I think the idea of him resting is from this creation, right? He's going to give us a way better one that's done. So I don't see them in competition. I think the idea is this, what we have now. Yeah. Good question. Joseph.
We were talking a little bit earlier about how, Adam is supposed to be an under-ruler of God. He's, in the sense, he's the son of God.
Yeah.
That because he's a representation of God on earth. And then we see Jesus is like the perfect son of God, like he's the one that represents him most perfectly. Is that why? Because, we hear a lot about their disagreements of, okay, well, how is Jesus like the son of God if he existed at the same time and he's not created and there's no heavenly mother of God, like how does that all, is that explanation of like, well, he came to earth as God's perfect representative, is that how he's the son of God?
That's a good question. To understand those titles, Son of Man, Son of God, we think of them in terms of just, our conception of son. Those are actually rooted in the Old Testament, right? So to understand what he means when he says Son of God, we have to understand the Old Testament. I think we do see that here, and it's fleshed out in God's covenant partners. Israel is called a what? In Exodus 4, verse 22. Israel, God calls him my firstborn what? Son. So Israel, in a sense, is going to act like a second Adam, another Adam, who's intended now not as an individual, but as a nation to reflect his rule and authority, right? Anyone know what the Davidic king is called in 2 Samuel 7? I will be unto you a father, and you will be unto me a... So now not only a nation, but the king who represents that nation is a son. So when you get to Jesus, there is this long line of Old Testament history of sonship being reflecting his rule and reflecting his glory and having a unique relationship with him. It doesn't necessarily mean offspring, right? So we use this phrase like father, like, right? And the idea is that there's a reflection of nature. You're like me, right? That's more the idea of ruler, representative of me. So when we hear Son of God, don't think father, mother, creation of a whole new person. We should think Old Testament. King, ruler, reflector, right? There is a uniqueness, right? Because God, the second person, steps into creation, right? And he's the Son. But I think that's more the idea of fulfilling Old Testament expectation. So does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Good questions. Anything else? Questions, comments? Yeah.
When you particularly, study any book of the Bible, do you try to stay away from going to other books and just see the text as it is? I noticed that throughout this time, all of us, we reference different things, but you kind of try to stay using that text to understand.
Yeah. So when you study a book of the Bible or a chapter or just a text, a paragraph, it's really helpful if you just read it and try and make your own observations. I also find it helpful after I make my own observations to read other books to see if I made any sense, right? Like if I came up with something new that's never been said before, I'm going to be like, well, let's pause and rethink this. But certainly the idea of image being son and dominion, I've read this text a bunch of times. I got that by reading another book where I was like, oh, I do see that in the text. Oh, and I do see that from other passages. It helped me a lot. So I think it's a both and. You want to study, you want to do your own work, right? You want to say, what do I see? Lord, help me see more. What's in the context? How does this relate to these different things? And just try and wrestle with it on your own. But we have 2,000 years of Christian writing of men who had the same spirit, who read the same Bible, that I think it's wise to say, what have some of them said? But understanding that those other books aren't inspired. They're fallible. They can be wrong. So when we read them, we want to go back and say, does that help me actually see what's there? Or is this way out in left field? So I think it's a both and. But I think you need to start with your own work and not depend on other people. Start there.
How do we marry together the image of God in Genesis and I know you're going to get there, the fallenness of man and Ephesians chapter 4, 24, true righteousness and true holiness.
Yeah. Questions about how do we marry together image of God, Genesis 1, to we have the fall. And we're now depraved in nature. The way that I would say it is the book of James tells us that we use our words to tear down people who are created in the image of God, right? So whatever we do, we have to say that the New Testament, post-fall, tells us we're still in the image of God. So it's not lost, it's not gone. But certainly, understanding sin, that image is marred. It's disfigured. It's not as it's intended to be, right? That's why we have to look to Jesus, who's not marred by sin, who is the perfect Adam, the perfect image of God, Yeah, so there's a balance. We still have it. It's not gone, but it's not like it's supposed to be. Good question. Maybe one more question or comment, and then we'll close in prayer.
We see the word holy used for the first time. What significance should that have or application?
Yeah, you talking about chapter 2 where he says this Sabbath Day is holy? Yeah, set apart. So there's something special about this day that Exodus and the rest of the Old Testament is going to tell us that this is a day where God's people set it apart from their normal work as a reflection of what God did. And unlike God, he gives us this because we do physically need rest. But it's not just a stop working rest. It's a focus, devote ourselves, consecrate ourselves to the Lord day. So it's not just sit around in your pajamas and do nothing because you need rest. It's a rest in the Lord. It's a trust in his lordship, where he rests, proving he's Lord. There's no rival. He's resting. And we rest in him, trusting in him. I don't need to go out and plow the field 7 days a week. One of those days I'm not going to work because I'm going to trust him. I'm not going to go into the town and sell my goods because I need the money 7 days a week. I'm going to trust him one day and I'm going to rest. The idea is a set apart day unto the Lord. Good questions. All right. Zach, you want to close us in prayer? Happy to stick around and talk as long as you want, but just for time's sake, we'll close it out now.
Lord God, thank you so much for the privilege of reading your word, hearing from you. Lord, I pray that based on what was said today out of your word, that you would impress this upon our hearts, that we would just see you more clearly in the Bible, that we would understand more what it means to be made in your image, to treat others in that way, Lord, and to so honor you, to look to you, Lord Jesus Christ, the one who is the radiance of the image of God. Trust in you, we depend upon you and your finished work. We ask that you would get glory as we live before you today, Lord. Please give us grace to honor you in our workplaces and everything that we do today, to image forth your goodness, your glory, your dominion everywhere, to share the gospel, to honor you, to treasure you above all. We love you, Lord, and we submit to you in your name. Amen.
Amen.